in his previous lab webinars. He's made significant contributions to eBird, and we all appreciate his extraordinary work as coordinator of the Los Angeles County effort for America's Birdiest County every April. Lance has been recording bird sounds since 2009 and has made many significant contributions to audio databases, including Xenocanto and the Macaulay Library through eBird. His recordings have been used in research papers, books, educational nature programs, smartphone apps, and for the development of sound recognition software. But Lance is also a superhero, helping save planet Earth from dangerous near-Earth asteroids in his work as planetary scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where he specializes in radar imaging of such asteroids. Talk about the ultimate in bird conservation work. We're very pleased to have Lance with us tonight to talk about confusing bird sounds, especially those you'll hear at night in the local mountains. So please, let's welcome Lance Better.
Well, thank you very much, Kimball, for the very kind words. Okay, well, let's get started here. We're going to do things a little differently this time relative to some of the previous LA Birders webinars that we've had. So if you read the description of the presentation tonight in the emails and the invitations and posts on the listservs and such, it mentioned owls and some diurnal species in the local mountains. It became apparent very quickly when I was putting the presentation together that we don't have time for all of that in just one talk. And so we're going to concentrate tonight on owls. Although the talk title that we circulated mentioned Southern California, this really applies pretty much throughout a good portion of the state, at least north of the transverse ranges. And so we're going to be discussing a number of the different species. We're going to be playing recordings. We're going to be looking at sonograms and all that sort of thing. And so the two sonograms you see in front of you are two that we're going to be discussing shortly. So here's an outline of what we're planning to do. There's been a lot of confusion with the sounds made by owls and things that people think are owls in the mountains in the southern part of the state. And this has been showing up in eBird and on listservs and so forth. And so we're hoping to perhaps shed a little bit of light on what's happening and to help everybody with sorting out what's going on and understanding common pitfalls, things where it's easy to go astray when you're trying to figure out what you're hearing. So we're going to go through a quick introduction, and we're going to include a couple of polls or sound quizzes, 3 of them actually. And then we're going to describe in turn northern pygmy owl, which is regularly confused with a lot of things, not just birds. Great horned owl, long-eared owl, and barn owl. It may seem strange to think that people might confuse those, but after we go through some recordings, I think you'll understand what that means. Northern saw-whet owl, western screech owl, and spotted owl. Although their principal advertising songs are quite different, they make a number of other sounds that can be really difficult to distinguish. And then we'll wrap it up with a comparison of flammulated owl and long-eared owl, whose kind of low frequency, low pitched hoots are quite easy to confuse. So we're going to be discussing sonograms, or also more formally known as audio spectrograms. Here's an example of one. This is from a recording of a barred owl that I got in Maine about 3.5 years ago. So sonograms are, as you, I hope, probably all realize, it's a visual depiction of sound. And it's somewhat analogous to seeing, say, sheet music, where you have time on the horizontal axis and then frequency or pitch on the vertical axis. So instead of musical notes, here we're doing frequency. The different dark things you see on this illustration are sounds made by this particular barred owl. Now you can see there were three or even 4 rows of sounds here. The principal one, the loudest one, is the one at the bottom, in this case, which is also the darkest one. In the sonograms, the darkest one shown, at least as shown in a grayscale or black and white version, the darkest one's going to be the loudest, and the other ones are going to be fainter. In this particular case, the bird was loud, it was quite close, and these are basically harmonics that you see above. The lowest pitch one near the bottom is the loudest. That's the principal one. So the sonogram here goes from 0 hertz, which is at such a low pitch or low frequency, you're just kind of, you wouldn't even feel it. It's below the realm of what people can detect, up to about 10,000 hertz or 10 kilohertz. And that's near the upper edge of hearing for a lot of people. For most of us, as we get older, our hearing changes. And so younger people can sometimes hear well above 10,000 hertz, sometimes up to 15 or 14 or 15,000 hertz. Some people, particularly if you went to a lot of rock concerts when you were younger, might not be able to hear much above 6,000 or 7,000 hertz. Most of the sounds we're going to present tonight will be under 5,000 hertz, so they should be within the realm of hearing for most people who might be in the audience tonight. So again, we'll keep this in mind as we go through the sonograms. So we're going to be playing sonograms that we're going to be playing recordings using the Audacity software, and the Audacity software will scroll the sonograms. There'll be a vertical green line, and it will march along across the display to show you which part it's currently playing. However, we're trying to present 29 different sound files, and to make things go more easily, more sort of smoothly, I've loaded them all up in advance, and that's actually making the memory in the computer a little bit sluggish. And as a result, when the sonograms are scrolling, it will be a little bit uneven. But as the talk progresses, and as I successively close down the files that we start with, the scrolling sonograms will get smoother. And we're going to alternate between PowerPoint and scrolling sonograms. So please be patient with me. I'm going to be switching back and forth. In fact, we're about to do that right now. So we're going to start up with the first sound poll. And so let's see. Let me bring this up. So this is going to be the first of the sonograms. And Ron, could you bring up the first poll, which will show everybody what the possible answers are? And so here it is. Here are the possible answers. So the talk, as I mentioned, is going to start by considering things that northern pygmy owls and things that are sources of confusion. And so the possible answers here are Miriam's chipmunk, northern pygmy owl, northern saw-whet owl, mountain quail, California ground squirrel, Townsend solitaire, or a mallard. Okay, so let's get it going here. So as you can see, the scrolling green line wasn't completely keeping up with the sound. The sound was continuous. So go ahead and mark your answers in the poll here, and let us know what you think the source of this sound is. This was a sound that was recorded during the day in the local San Gabriel Mountains.
Right now we have about 20%, about 50% of the audience, of the attendees voting.
So the principal source of sound to concentrate on is this stuff here near the bottom. There were other things vocalizing here. For example, there was a purple finch. I forget what else I had in the recording. There might have been a black-throated gray warbler in there, maybe a dark-eyed junco. But the thing we want to concentrate on are these sources of sound down here between 1,000 and 1.5 kilohertz. Alrighty, let's give it a few more seconds.
Okay.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Ah, that's it.
Stop. Okay, so what did people think this is?
Oh, wow. Here are the results.
Okay. Well, so this is interesting. Yeah, somebody. Thank you, who thought it was a mallard. So 31% thought it was a chipmunk. 31% thought it was a mountain quail. Those were the two answers people selected the most. And we had a few people thought a saw-whet. A few people thought a pygmy owl. Three people voted for ground squirrel. One person voted for a solitaire. Okay, well, the answer for this is, in fact, Miriam's chipmunk. So this was recorded during the day near the trailhead from Mount Baden-Powell in April. And this is a source of a lot of confusion. We'll talk about this more later on, but I wanted to start off with this because this is a sound that is often misidentified. And if you look around in eBird and check eBird records for northern pygmy owl, you will find quite a few chipmunks that people misidentified. Okay, so let's go ahead and stop that one. And now we're going to start up. Let's wait on that, please, Ron.
I'm sorry.
Let me get the next poll up. I mean, the next sound up first. Okay, so close down the first file. Okay, now you should see a file that says 02 poll 2. Okay, now please bring up the poll, Ron.
Got it. Here we go.
Okay, and so the answers are the same as last time, and let us know what you think this sound is. Okay, so again, we're concentrating on the sound down here at just over 1,000 hertz. There were some loud sounds in there by chickadees and dark-eyed juncos, and if your hearing is really astute, there was also a bat that was making ticking sounds as it flew by. So we'll give people a little bit more time to let us know what they think this one is before we close it down.
And was this recorded during the day, Lance?
This was recorded around sunset. Actually, the one before was also recorded around sunset. There was definitely still plenty of light in the sky, but northern pygmy owls are often active at that time of the day, and so are squirrels and chipmunks and all kinds of other things, mountain quail. So that's part of why there's confusion. All right, so let's count this down. 5, 4,
3, 2, and 1, and polling is ended.
All right, let's bring up the answers, the responses. All right, just over half of you thought this was a pygmy owl. Only one vote for a chipmunk. Well, of course, I did chipmunk in the first poll, so that might be part of the reason why. There were about a fourth of the people thought this was a saw-whet owl. We had some more votes for mountain quail, and someone, as always, voted for a mallard. And also we got a vote for a ground squirrel. So this was, in fact, a northern pygmy owl. It was recorded in the same place as the Miriam's chipmunk in the previous recording, and only maybe 10 minutes later than the chipmunk was recorded. So you can, in fact, hear both of these species in the same place at the same time, and that's another source of confusion. And we're going to show an example of two things at the same time shortly in another slide. So we have one more poll. Let me bring up the sound recording first, Ron, before we bring the poll up. Okay, and let me close down one of the files to get that out of our way. Let's see. So let's bring up the poll, the possible responses. The possible answers are the same as they were before. So again, your options are Miriam's chipmunk, northern pygmy owl, northern saw-whet owl, mountain quail, California ground squirrel, Townsend solitaire, or mallard. And so now let's go ahead and play this. So you can hear what this sounds like. Okay, so this was recorded at sunrise, so early in the morning. There were a number of things vocalizing there. There was a wren-tit, there was a spotted towhee, there was a call from a California thrasher. But the thing that we care about the most are these rapid sounds down here between 1.5 and 2 kilohertz. And so go ahead and cast your votes for what you think that sound is. Keep in mind that we might repeat the species. I haven't ruled that out. And I'll give people a few more seconds to decide. Are we getting some votes, Ron?
We are. We're about 55% right now, pushing 60% actually.
Okay.
So, and
All right. Why don't you start your countdown?
It's slowing down. So 5, 4. Get your last votes in. 3, 2. One more second. 1, and we are ended.
Okay. Let's have a look at the responses. Okay. So so they were spread out quite a bit on this one. The number one response with 9 people was mountain quail. Let's see, 8 people responded California ground squirrel. We got 5 votes for Townsend solitaire, 5 votes for northern saw-whet owl, 2 votes for mallard, and 2 votes for a pygmy owl. So this is in fact a mountain quail. This was recorded in an area of chaparral at sunrise. A place called Hoyt Mountain, which is there's a dirt road that goes up toward Grizzly Flats on the northeast side of Mount Lukens. This was recorded with a sound logger at sunrise back in February. So okay, let's go ahead and close this out, and let's see. Hold on a sec. Let me close that sound file, get it out of our way. And I'll bring up, let's see, we had something in the chat. And Kimball asked a question, at the elevation we had earlier, could we have, with the first 2 polls, could we have ruled out a lodgepole chipmunk? Kimball, that's a perceptive point. No, I cannot. It could have been either. The elevations for Miriam's chipmunk and lodgepole chipmunk actually overlap. You're right. We're going to have another one later on that is at a lower elevation that I'm pretty sure was in fact at Miriam's. So let's go ahead and bring up the PowerPoint again. And okay, so let's talk about northern pygmy owls. I'm going to play some examples of sounds they make, some other ones. But before we do that, I wanted to say a few things about where in California you can find them, because this is another source of confusion. If you look at some of the field guides, unfortunately, if you look at nearly all of the field guides, especially ones that aren't, say, the most recent edition, they will show northern pygmy owl occurring down in rivers and basically in the San Jacintos and in the mountains in San Diego County. It turns out there are, in fact, no documented records there. And so if you ever think you found a pygmy owl in the San Jacinto Mountains or the mountains in Orange County or Palomar or Mount Laguna and so forth, that would be pretty darn interesting. And please document it. Please try to get a photo, get recordings, describe it, that sort of thing. There have been claims in the past of this, but there have been no one's ever actually gotten a good recording or a photograph or a video or a specimen. So I just want to point that out. Now in the San Bernardino Mountains, northern pygmy owls do occur there, but they're uncommon. If you move one mountain range to the west in the San Gabriels, pygmy owls are relatively common in the San Gabriel Mountains. And then north of there up through the Sierra Nevada and then up along the coastal ranges, northern pygmy owls again are relatively common. But as we just saw, there are a number of things that make sounds especially chipmunks and quail, and northern saw-whet owls that sound pretty similar, and so it's easy to get confused. So we've already briefly mentioned this, but yeah, so the principal sources of confusion: saw-whets, mountain quail, Townsend solitaires. That may sound strange, but what we're thinking of here are the calls, not the songs. The two species of chipmunks, at least in southern part of California. Now, there are a lot of other chipmunks elsewhere in the state, and I don't claim to be an expert on those. Ground squirrels and even gray squirrels. So there are, in fact, a number of recordings that have been uploaded to eBird that were chipmunks of various species. From time to time, I look around in eBird to check for that sort of thing, and if I notice something, I'll flag it, and then the eBird moderators will go and have another look. So these misidentifications are one of the principal reasons why pygmy owl records in eBird in Los Angeles County now require documentation. There were just too many instances where the documentation just didn't support it, or in cases where there were a lot of observers reporting a pygmy owl in a particular place. I went up there and looked and found chipmunks and squirrels and no pygmy owls. So although this is an issue in Los Angeles County, it's an issue elsewhere too, not just down here. So again, and you may hear me say this multiple times tonight, if you think you find a pygmy owl anywhere in the state, please get a recording. If you see it, describe its appearance, try to get photos. Your phone probably is sufficiently sensitive to get a decent recording of it, so please give it a try if you think you found one. It's really easy to misidentify these. So having said that, let's stop the PowerPoint and let's go on to listen to some other examples. Actually, I see there's a question here. Okay, so there's a comment from Kimball who says, yeah, at least two well-known birders attending the webinar thought they heard northern pygmy owls in the San Jacintos in the 1970s during big days. Yeah, which suggests a lot more about desperation and wishful thinking. Yeah, so I wish it were true, but no one's ever found one there. And John Dunn asks the question, do California pygmy owls ever call in the middle of the night? And the answer to that question is yes. And we're going to hear an example of that in a few minutes. Okay, so let me bring up some more recordings here. In fact, it's this recording. This was recorded just after 11 p.m. at the Charlton Flats picnic area in the San Gabriel Mountains. About 4 years ago in 2017. This was a northern pygmy owl that was spontaneously tooting when I got out of the car. So northern pygmy owls, although they vocalize when they toot like this, principally at a frequency of about 1100 hertz, it is variable. The females also toot, usually when you hear one, it's a male, but the females also toot. And the female toots are usually at a slightly higher pitch, which if you hear them, you can distinguish. But the individuals can also vary it. I've heard them do that. So regarding hearing them late at night, there is this kind of conventional wisdom that northern pygmy owls don't vocalize after it gets truly dark, at least in the evening, or before it starts to get light at dawn. It's uncommon, but it does happen. And I've heard it happen spontaneously without any playback on my part on several occasions in the San Gabriel Mountains. A couple of those occasions, 4 of those occasions, it was in 2 different locations, probably the same individual. And the conditions were similar, bright nights with moonlight. This one that we just heard was at a different place, and the moon was actually not out that night. All right, so let's go on to the next one. So let's see, close down the file we just listened to. And for comparison now, we're going to play a northern saw-whet owl. This was one that I recorded in the San Gabriel Mountains about 3 years ago. And you'll notice, you can see, so the principal sound is this dark stuff at, again, about 1,000 hertz. And then there's a harmonic at about double the frequency, which is a lot fainter. So this is a lot faster in its cadence, although the pitch is quite similar. So in typical saw-whet fashion, male saw-whets will do this sometimes for hours. So they vocalize more rapidly usually than a pygmy owl will. And the duration of the toots is usually shorter. So this one is tooting 2 to 3 times a second, whereas the northern pygmy owls here in California typically toot about once every 2 to 3 seconds. So it's the distinctly different cadence between the two species. Nevertheless, they are still often confused. So now let's listen to another chipmunk. Let's see, we'll close down the saw-whet that we just listened to. So this next recording is kind of complicated. There are actually 2 different rodents that are vocalizing on it. You can see that down here at about 1 kilohertz, there's a sound, here's a sound, there's a sound. And then there are these other things here, and some of those sounds actually are off the scale here. They're at a range of frequencies that's vocalizing much more rapidly. And then there are some other sounds from diurnal birds in here, like oak titmice, and I think there might be some spotted towhees and maybe purple finches. So this was a sound recorded at the Chileo Visitor Center in the San Gabriel Mountains at a time 3 years ago when a lot of people were reporting northern pygmy owls there, but nobody ever photographed one. No one ever reported a visual. So unfortunately, I don't believe any of those reports. So here we go. And the woodpecker as well. Titmouse somewhere in the background. Acorn woodpeckers. So again, it's these toots here, and they're coming in at about the right frequency for a pygmy owl, about once every 1.5 to 2 seconds. But they're generally shorter in duration than the pygmy owls, which is one of the things to look for to distinguish them. And in fact, if we kept going with the recording, let's see, if we progress toward the end, the sounds kind of morph, they change. And they sound different, a little bit different from the way pygmy owls usually sound. But they're still really easy to confuse. So that's why we suggest, again, that if you hear one of these things, please try to record it. And see, we have another comment from John Dunn, who says that unspotted saw-whets sound just like northern saw-whets. Well, John, I'm really glad that you've had the opportunity to hear one of those. I never have. Unspotted saw-whet owl is a bird that is found in Central America, not this far north. Okay, so let's go on to the next recording. And now we're going to play an example of a ground squirrel. Show you. They can sound similar. This one is actually, I think, going to be fairly straightforward to identify. This was recorded in Chaparral here in Altadena. So a much higher pitch than a saw-whet owl or than a pygmy owl. In this particular case, it's making a sound about once every second or so, once every 1 to 1.5 seconds. It sounds distinctly different from the owls, but these are another source of confusion. Okay, let's see, is there another question? John asks, why not a slow northern saw-whet? Can saw-whets slow down? Yes, they sometimes do, but if they do that, they don't usually do it for very long. Their vocalizations are certainly variable, and we're going to hear some real variability. This is specifically with the toots. But it's uncommon to hear a northern saw-whet owl toot as slowly as once every 2 seconds, at least for any extended interval. You might hear intermittent toots, and they're usually, if you listen long enough, accompanied by other sounds. It's unusual to hear a lengthy episode of individual toots. I can't say it's impossible, but it's just not something you hear very often. Downright rare, to be honest. Okay, so now let's, for comparison, listen to a mountain quail. This was recorded on the south side of Mount Wilson about 2 months ago. It's also an acorn woodpecker. There was another squirrel in there. It was also a Buick's wren. It was a California thrasher. So these are the sounds that are often referred to as quarks, not to be confused with the elementary particle and particle physics that people like Mark Scheel are familiar with. But this is a common sound, probably the most widely known mountain quail sound. The ones that I played earlier, those rapid calls, are not as well known, although you hear them a lot early in the day, particularly in the winter. So this is a more typical kind of mountain quail sound. But again, a number of people have asked me about these and have gotten them mixed up with both pygmy owls and saw-whet owls. So let's move on. And so now we're going to hear an example of a recording with both a pygmy owl and a mountain quail. So you can directly compare them. In this particular case, there are some brief there were some brief bursts of noise in the recording, so I removed them, but I maintained the interval of time in the recording. So these things here at about 1 kilohertz are the pygmy owl. These things at 1.5 kilohertz are the mountain quail, and then there are some little sounds down here that, if I remember correctly, are a western screech owl. Screech owl, mountain quail. Pygmy owl again. Screech owl and pygmy owl, and here comes the quail. So the reason I masked out some sounds is there were episodic bangs like this one right here. I'll play that again so you can hear it. And that is the sound of a guardrail cooling down at night, at dusk. This particular location had a very loud guardrail on that particular day. So that had both a pygmy owl and a mountain quail, and for good measure, a western screech owl. Okay, so let's see, our next one is going to be a Townsend solitaire. This is a significantly higher pitched sound than the owls, but excuse me, it's another source of confusion. It's not a very loud recording. It's why it looks kind of faint. And it's these things right here at a frequency of about maybe 2.7 kilohertz. This was recorded during this year's Birdiest County up at Blue Ridge Campground in the San Gabriel Mountains. Oops. Try that again. I would also point out that this was recorded with a cell phone. And so even though it's not very loud, it was good enough to identify the species. Okay, so I think at this point, I want to go back to my PowerPoint, assuming I can find it. Here we go. So we've done pygmy owls. Let's see. All right, we did pygmy owls in this area. I briefly want to mention that there are, of course, other subspecies of pygmy owls. And so if you happen to be in the Rocky Mountains, you will hear, if you hear a pygmy owl, it's going to sound a little bit different. And in particular, they are faster than the pygmy owls that we have here in California. It's a different subspecies. So let's briefly play one example of that, and then we'll move on to great horned owls. So let's see, I think we want this one. All right, let me close down the solitaire file. And so this is going to be a northern pygmy owl recorded in the Pinaleño Mountains in southern Arizona, Mount Graham to be specific, which appears to be close to the edge of the southern edge of the range for the interior northern pygmy owl. And we're about to hear a second one. So two pygmy owls vocalizing at different pitches. My guess is that the one at the higher pitch is a female. Those sounds, those are really easy to confuse with the mountain quail sound that I played during the quiz. But if you hear a pygmy owl do that, after doing that for maybe a few seconds, it usually transitions into some toots. So again, this highlights that northern pygmy owls in the Rocky Mountains east of us can sound quite a bit different. They toot faster. In this case, it's about once a second. And so it's quite a bit faster than the pygmy owls here in California, and they are harder to identify. And some of my experiences with them, although not very large in number, they can be very, very difficult, and sometimes I can't tell. Okay, so let's go back to the PowerPoint and say a few things about great horned owls and possible sources of confusion here. So great horned owls make a lot of different sounds. Many people are familiar with the woo-hoo-hoo sound, but that's not the only sound they make, even though it may be the one that you hear the most frequently. And part of the confusion here is that just a lot of people don't know that great horned owls make other sounds. And in addition, if you rely on apps on your phone apps to identify them, they're incomplete. They don't have the full dynamic range of great horned owl sounds. And so if you hear one that you don't recognize and you check it on a phone app, it might lead you astray to think that it's actually something else. So this can cause confusion with some other species. So we're going to hear some examples of duets. There are going to be some squawks in there, which are usually made by females, some begging calls, and some whack-whack calls. And let's see, do this. Let's see, we had a question. Yeah, John mentioned that one of those calls, I think you meant from the pygmy owls in Arizona, sounded kind of like a trogon. Yes, it did, but we were looking at it, so we know it was a pygmy owl. Okay, so let's see. So here's a great horned owl recording. So this was recorded right here in my yard in the summer. So this is going to be sounds by multiple birds. It's going to start off with hoots by an adult, and then there are going to be some loud, raspy begging sounds and shrieks and bill snapping from a fledgling. So we heard a number of different things here. We heard the hooting by the adult, and then these raspy, loud begging calls. This part of the sonogram, I'm not quite sure what was happening there. It might have been, the adult might have been giving the young one some food, or I'm not completely sure. I didn't actually see the interaction. And then there were these, let's see, there were these vertical lines here, 4 of them. Those were beak snapping by the young bird. And then there was one vertical line here, which was a source of handling noise when I messed up with the microphone. So these squawks, sort of raspy squawks, are the source of quite a bit of confusion. If you live in a suburban area where great horned owls nest, you probably hear this or fairly frequently in the summer and fall. But if you don't live in such a place, that might not be a very familiar sound. And that's a source of confusion where a number of people mistake long-eared owls and even barn owls for great horned owls. Actually, the other way around. They mistake great horned owls for the other ones. Here's another example. This is some squawking sounds made by a great horned owl, probably a female. In fact, I know it was a female because there was also a great horned owl male hooting at the same time in the area. And I heard these squawking sounds transition into a female. So this was on Glendora Mountain Road last year. So that's a sound that actually carries surprisingly far. It's quite loud, and it's made primarily by the females. I'm not sure if it's entirely made by the females or not. From what I understand from talking with Carla Blom at the International Owl Center, males do this sometimes too. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Let's see. Did we already do that one? No, here we go. Okay, this is going to be another example of some begging sounds. Actually, squawks by great horned owls. Sort of like the last one, but and then it transitions to hoots. It's the same bird. Okay, and then we want to do some different ones. These are going to be more begging. No, these aren't begging calls. These are whack whack calls. Another great horned owl sound that isn't all that widely known. You hear this occasionally. I've heard it here in Altadena several times now, and I get questions about this a few times a year from people asking me what this is. So that's a great horned owl. It's a sound that's made by adults. It's not entirely clear what that means, though. I took a look at the Birds of North America article on that species in an attempt to understand get some insight into what that is, and it didn't say much, just said that it's thought to indicate an instance when the bird is disturbed. That particular recording, it was on a tree across the street from my house, and the bird was just there for many minutes. If it was disturbed, it didn't appear to be disturbed. So at any rate, here is a long-eared owl sound for comparison. This is what's known as the female nesting call. It's basically a type of hoot. And it's fairly common. Long-eared owls often duet, and when they do, this is the sound that you'll hear from the female. It's somewhat like the squawks from the great horned owl. In fact, I think that those squawks, great horned owl squawks, are one of the principal sources of confusion where people misidentify long-eared owls when in fact they're hearing great horned owls. That sort of thing happens fairly often in the Northeast. There just seems to be this thing where people really want to find a long-eared owl, and often they're hearing a great horned owl instead. So here, in this next one, we're going to hear a duet with two long-eared owls. There'll be a male that'll start. There'll be some hoots similar to the last one we just heard from a female, and then there'll be some little snapping sounds, and I'll tell you more about those after we hear it. So that's the male. Now we're about to hear both. Female, male. male. So yeah, this is a duet. The two birds are hooting. This was a mated pair, in a place where they subsequently nested. And those snapping sounds that are indicated by these vertical lines, that was actually the male clapping his wings, which they do during flight displays. Um, and I know that that's what was happening here because I saw the male. I was just sitting there trying to figure out what this was, and then he landed in a tree about 10 feet from me. Um, John Dunn asked, "Do long-eared owls call in the winter?" Yeah, a lot of those are reported on the Christmas bird counts. I echo your skepticism, John, about that. I personally have not heard one at that time of the year. Um, my experience with the species, at least in terms of hearing them, has been during the late winter into the early summer. Um, yeah, I know some very experienced birders who think they've heard a long-eared owl. The records have been accepted during Christmas counts and so forth. I'm not sure what to think. Having not been there and not hearing any recordings, I don't know what to say. I would imagine some of those are almost certainly misidentifications. Maybe some of them aren't. I don't know. But yeah, I'd love to be there sometime when that happens. Um, okay, so we're going to hear different long-eared owl sound next. These are alarm barks, these dark vertical things here, followed by some begging calls by some nestlings, and then another alarm bark. And there'll be a few of these. So these alarm barks are another possible source of confusion with great horned owls. Don't sound like one to me, but people might think that. Okay, let's go on to the next one. And so our next example is actually going to be a barn owl. Now, you may not think that barn owl can sound much at all like a great horned owl, but if you're unfamiliar with some of the sounds that I'm playing, for example, the long-eared owl sounds, the great horned owl sounds, or if you just don't hear barn owls very much, it's easy to get confused. Now, this next barn owl sound is a very loud one. It was recorded at close range here in California. This is from the collection at the Cornell lab. If you were to hear this at a greater distance, it would be easier to confuse it. But again, it's easier to confuse, particularly if you're not very familiar with the sound. So let's see. So long-eared says that, John says that long-eared do call during the day on nesting grounds. Yes, they sometimes do. Feel free to elaborate on that, John. You can maybe type in some more about the type of vocalization that you've heard. When I've heard them calling during the day, it's either been the begging calls from the nestlings or some very high-pitched, soft little calls from adults. Okay, so let me go back to PowerPoint. We've gotten a little bit ahead of where I was in PowerPoint. So we've already made these points about great horned owls, long-eared owls, barn owls, and now we want to move on to northern saw-whet, western screech, and spotted. So it's close to 8 o'clock, so I'm going to try to scoot along here so we don't run too late. So the sounds that we're going to discuss aren't the toots that are made by northern saw-whet owls, and we heard an earlier example of that, or the bouncing ball and double trill sounds from western screech owls. We heard a faint example of that. We'll hear more of those momentarily. Or the 4-note sounds from 4 or 5-note sounds from spotted owls. The sort of woo, 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 woo. That's a typical 4-note sound from a California spotted owl. Those aren't the type of sounds I'm referring to here. There are, in fact, a lot of whines and wails and barks that all three of these species make, and they can be surprisingly similar if you're not familiar with them. Even if you are familiar with them, they can be very difficult to distinguish. And so here is an example. So this, let's see if I can get this to come up. So this is going to be a northern saw-whet owl. These are some very loud whining sounds. You can hear these throughout the year, but they're a little bit more common in the fall and early winter. So here we go. There was a great horned owl in the background down there. So as you can see from the sonogram, the wails here, these whines, they change. The next one's going to sound different. You hear how it kind of wavers, and then it changes again. A gap in the recording, and then something different again. So northern saw-whet owl whines may seem straightforward to identify, but they can be really tricky relative to western screech owls. In this case, we had the benefit of these toots that the saw-whet made. Screech owls, when they do their bouncing balls, double trills, barking sounds, it just sounds different. It doesn't sound like that. So let's hear another example. Oops, hold on, let me bring up the next one. So this next one is going to have more of those loud whines, but it's also going to have some other sounds in it. At the beginning here, these are sounds that are referred to as barks or kissu calls, and then they're going to change, and then they're going to turn into whines, all from the same individual. Those barking calls at the beginning are sounds you hear most frequently during late fall and winter. You can hear them at other times of the year, but not as often as in the fall and winter. And here comes another whine. So these sounds were actually heard in response to playback. All right, let's see. We have another question. Okay, yeah, so John put another comment in here about the long-eared owls hooting in mid-morning and some barks. And he mentions the sound approach to birding, which is it's a book from Europe. Yeah, it mentions that New World and Old World barn owls can sound quite different. Yeah, John mentions in his experiences, saw-whets in response to playback often start with whines. Well, that's actually highly variable. You can hear a variety of different things. I've heard them start with toots, with whines, with barks, with all sorts of different things. So our next one is going to give you another example. So this next recording, this was recorded in response to playback during the Christmas count in Farmington, Maine, last December. I was in a wooded area with a lot of spruce and fir. There's also a little bit of sound, some low rumble from a distant highway, some wind, and also a trickle of water. So we're going to start off with some rapid sounds right here, which are different from anything else we've heard, and then some whines, and then they're going to transition into toots. Gap in the recording. So then it will transition into something different from these other whines. A little softer, not as loud. Now let me speed this up a little bit, kind of cut right to the chase here. Then it's going to transition into some toots. then it keeps going. The sounds we heard at the beginning, those you really can't confuse with a pygmy or screech or spotted. I've never heard any other species in North America do that. Let me play that again. It's probably not familiar to very many people. It's often heard when I've heard it, it's most often been in response to playback, but not always. Sometimes you'll just hear them do that. Okay, let's keep on moving. This time we're going to do some Western screech owl sounds. And then you'll start to see what I mean when I say that they're easy to confuse. So these look like the wails of a saw-whet. They are, in fact, a Western screech owl. These were heard in response to playback in the San Gabriel Mountains about 4 years ago. And there are two birds there that are vocalizing. And so if you're wondering how I know that these are in fact a screech owl and not a great horned owl, that's because as the recording kept going, it changed into this. So clearly a Western screech owl sound. So I've also seen Western screech owls when they've made these vocalizations. It's probably the trickiest one of all of these to sort out. And sometimes I can't tell them apart. Again, something that you hear most frequently, let's bring up the PowerPoint again, that you hear most frequently during kind of the fall and winter, often in response to playback. So here they are. This was the one of the slides at the beginning of the presentation, which I also just played for you, which had the saw-whet tooting and then wailing. And then the one we just heard just a moment ago, the beginning of that one with these wails that then transitioned into a Western screech owl. Okay, hold on a sec. We're not quite ready for Flammulated owl yet. We have a little bit we want to do with spotted owl. Let's see, there's another question. A question about entry-level recorder. Yeah, we'll get to that at the end of the presentation. So let's see, where were we? A couple more Western screech owls. They make a lot of different sounds, so let's play a couple more examples. Here are some barks. Again, Western screech owl. These are fairly common sounds to hear spontaneously at dusk, sometimes before sunset. You can also hear it if you use recordings. Pretty common sound. And let's see, so we just did I just do this one? Yeah, I just did that one, okay. Stop the share with that one, and now we're going to move on to spotted owl. And I want to play some examples of those. These are going to be a number of different sounds. We're going to start off with some barks. Hear this again. Okay, let's go on to the next recording. So this next recording will also have some barks, but it's going to have some other stuff too, if I remember correctly. Yeah, so these are barks. There are going to be some other calls by male, and there are also going to be some variable wails. That was a male. So spotted owls are highly variable as well. This next one is going to show you more of their repertoire. So these upward sweeping things, those are contact calls, usually made by females, although the males do them too. And then there'll be a series of vocalizations here by the males. Some more upward sweeping calls. We'll play a few of those. There's a screech owl there in the background. That's the male. So you could hear the calls by both sexes here. The female voice is higher pitched. The female has a smaller syrinx than the male. So spotted owls can be surprisingly tricky. They're easy to confuse with some of the other species. And so that's why I wanted to point this out. There have been times when I've heard some of these sounds and I wasn't sure if it was a spotted, a saw-whet, or a screech. And so one of the ways that you try to figure that out is by recording it and just keep on listening. And eventually you'll be able to sort it out. So the last thing we want to talk about here before we wrap it up is possible confusion between long-eared and flammulated owls. So this is the recording we played earlier of two duetting long-eared owls. There's the male. Wing claps. Male again. So it's the male sounds in particular that I wanted to highlight here. Let's play this again. Okay, and now for comparison, let's play a flammulated owl. Again, this will be a male. Female flammulated owls don't make the vocalizations that I'm about to play. Now, also at a very low pitch. In fact, let's zoom that in a little bit, see if this will let me do that. So here it is. Similar frequency, similar pitch to the long-eared owl, but these vocalizations tend to be shorter in duration. And they kind of rise and fall with time. Whereas the male long-eared owl, that does that too, but it's longer. But then flammulated owls will often have other components to their song, like that. So from a distance, or if you're not that familiar with the species, it's actually surprisingly easy to mix these up. I've done it myself. I was hearing a long-eared owl, and for a couple of weeks, I thought it was a flammulated owl. Fortunately, I was able to see the bird, and that settled the matter rather thoroughly. So to wrap things up, if we go back to the PowerPoint, so we've already talked about saw-whets. We just described flammulated and long-eared. So some concluding thoughts from all of this. As I hope you can now see, there are lots of possible sources of confusion with owl sounds, not only in Southern California, but for owls throughout the state. And of course, there could be other examples besides the species that I showed here. So if you're out and you hear some unfamiliar sound at night, I would recommend trying to record it. Your cell phone probably is better than you realize. It can probably get something, and that could be really, really helpful to sorting it out. If you do get recordings, try to get recordings that last more than a few seconds. A lot of people who are new to recording sounds just get a couple of seconds, and we need to have more than that. Cell phones nowadays come, at least the smart cell phones, come with recording apps, and they're pretty darn good. And you can get dedicated ones that are more sophisticated ones like Voice Record Pro for less than $10 that are even more capable than the ones that come with the phone. So as I mentioned earlier, at least in Los Angeles County, eBird now requires documentation for northern pygmy owl because of all the confusion. Long-eared owl as well, not so much because of confusion in that case, but because they're a sensitive and rare species now. So if you think you find some of these, please record them. If you have a camera and you have a chance to get photos, please try that too. There have been frequent or numerous instances where people thought they were hearing northern saw-whet owls tooting in the afternoon. That can happen, but it's rare. Usually that means that something else is vocalizing, like a chipmunk or a squirrel. Now, having said that, I have heard saw-whet owls tooting in the middle of the afternoon. I think I've heard it a grand total of once, spontaneously, without any prompting using playback. When that occurs, it usually happens in the spring when the males are trying to attract a mate, but it's rare. Again, if you think you hear that, please record it. So I keep alluding to confusion with among barn owl, great horned owl, and long-eared owl. That seems to be a bigger issue in the East and the upper Midwest. I'm aware of more reports where people think they're hearing a barn owl or a long-eared owl, but it turns out that they probably heard a great horned owl. And really, you ought to think of great horned owl first because they're much more common species, but they have a lot of different sounds they make. And you may not be familiar with them if you haven't spent much time outside at night. And if you rely on phone apps for identification, well, you really should consider something else because the phone apps, for the most part, aren't complete. There are sounds that they just don't include. So if you're interested in getting more recordings, there are sources of recordings out there. The Zeno Canto website has, at least in terms of owls in California, has hundreds of examples for most of the species that occur in the state. Certainly for here in Southern California, there are hundreds of examples for the species that are in the mountains. eBird and its Macaulay Library, which are both part of the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology, they have recordings that you can listen to. The Xenocantha recordings you can actually download, with a few exceptions for sensitive species, but most of those you can download. 15 years ago, the Cornell Laboratory issued a pair of compact discs called The Voices of North American Owls. It's a superb collection that includes a lot of unusual sounds. It's no longer in print, but you can still find copies on Amazon and in the NHBS website, probably elsewhere as well. And you can load it into your laptop and then onto your phone. More recently, just within the last several months, Cornell released the Cornell Guide to Bird Sounds. And for a mere $20, you can have, I think it's something like 8 recordings of close to 800 species that have been recorded in the US, Canada, and it includes Hawaii, if I remember correctly. It's a wonderful collection. You can also load that onto your phone. So I'm going to leave this up. If you want to jot this down, actually the quickest way to save this, if this information is of interest to you, is just take a picture of it. And with that, let me take some questions. And let's see.
Questions are pouring in, Lance.
Okay. So Carrie asked the question about recommending an entry-level sound recorder. Well, my recommendation would be to start with your phone, give that a try first, and see how it goes. But if you're interested in something more sophisticated, that's really dedicated to designed for recording things, I've heard very good things about the Tascam DR05 model. I don't personally have one, but I think they cost about $100. They have some very nice features. They have a pre-record buffer where you hit the button and it will record for a few seconds, and it'll just keep doing that. So then if you hit the button again, then it has from the time you hit the button backward a few seconds as well as forward until you tell it to stop. It's a really handy feature. It's not a very expensive recorder, but you can connect really complicated, sophisticated, and really good external microphones to it if you want to try that, although you can do very well without them. So let's see, Naresh asks, so if you hear whales at night and it doesn't change into something recognizable, should you just let it go? Well, I'd recommend trying to get a recording. In my experience, often the saw-whet sounds tend to be louder, more emphatic, not always, but often. And the examples I played for saw-whet, western screech, and spotted owl Something that can happen, doesn't always, but can happen, is that those birds will often transition and make some other sound after they do the wails. Not always, um, but that will be a clue. I mean, also of course, if you're lucky enough to see them, that of course would really cinch it. Um, but sometimes you really can't tell, or and in other occasions the sounds may stop and you may not hear anything else. Western screech owls are notorious for that in the late fall. If you try playing recordings, and it could be a recording of a screech, of a saw-whet, of a spotted owl, or a pygmy owl, Western screech owls will respond to all of those. And in the late fall, they will often respond by wailing. And so try to record it and see what happens. You may have to let some go, but I think you'll be able to sort out the majority of them. So let's see. I'll get to your point there, and John, in a sec. Let me address Lily's comment. So how do you ID an owl with its whining? Well, that's what I was just trying to address with what Naresh said. With some experience, you can identify the different kinds of whines. Those sheep kinds of calls, those are fairly distinct if that's what you're hearing. Those are spotted owls, but some of them waver, and that's when they get a little bit ambiguous. Or if they're not very close and they're faint, then they get harder. Try to get a recording, and if you have such recordings, I'd be glad to help you try to sort them out. But a lot of it's experience. Compare, if you can get some software like Audacity, which is what I was using tonight, or Raven Light. They're both free. They both generate sonograms, and they can show you examples. And so you can compare them with those that you can see, for example, on the Cornell Macaulay Library website. So let's see, John Dunn, he says, from my experience, the dawn is often greeted by a northern pygmy owl. He describes as a chuckle followed by a toot and then single toots. Yes, you do sometimes hear that, and pygmy owls will sometimes do that before there's much light in the sky at all. Sometimes it's still quite dark, so that can happen more than an hour before sunrise. Old World long-eared owls have different pitched calls and lots of other plumage differences, plus reddish eyes. Yeah, there's a growing body of evidence that long-eared owls in Eurasia and in North America are they're different, and they look different. There are some behavior differences. There are sound differences. It wouldn't surprise me if those get split. Let's see. So Don White says, if you hear owl sounds during the day before sunset, would I mostly rule out some species and say other species are more likely? Or can you hear basically any of the owls in the area during the day as well as at night? Okay, well, so yes, some of our local owls do vocalize during the day, some of them much more so than others. For example, northern pygmy owls, I didn't really go into this, but northern pygmy owls often vocalize in the morning after sunrise, and in the evening before sunset, sometimes even in the middle of the day. I think you're more likely to hear one during the day in the winter, late fall and the winter, than you are, say, right now in May. At least that's been my experience. But that you can hear northern pygmy owls during the day, primarily though around sunrise and sunset. Great horned owls during the late winter and early spring regularly vocalize an hour or two before sunset, particularly if it's kind of an overcast, gloomy day. I've heard that many times. If you're farther north in California or someplace farther east where there are barred owls, they're well known for vocalizing any time of the day, regardless of the weather conditions. I've heard those, middle of the afternoon, late morning. They're well known to do that. Northern saw-whet owl, as I mentioned, it's uncommon, but occasionally you'll hear the males tooting during the spring, late winter and spring when they're trying to attract a mate. Possibly before sunset, again at that time of the year. Now, of course, I'm talking mostly about adults. If there's like a nest with young, they might vocalize. In fact, they do. Young saw-whets at a nest will vocalize after sunrise. And some of the other species probably do that too. I know that long-eared owls do as well. Um, and let's see, other species, spotted owls often vocalize shortly before sunset. I haven't had much experience with those around sunrise, but they definitely will vocalize. I've heard them half an hour before sunset, adults and young in a nest. Right around dusk is a really good time to hear spotted owls. It's often when they're most vocal. Long-eared owls, well, so we've already talked about that a little bit. But in terms of if you're in a place where there's a nest or where there's a pair that's courting that is trying to nest, they will sometimes start vocalizing right about sunset. They'll start hooting. Usually you'll hear the male first. At least in my limited experience, I've heard this a modest number of times, maybe 10 times or so. The young long-eared owls will vocalize a little bit before sunset, sometimes before the adults will, and they're really loud. Flammulated owls, I've never heard them during the day. I've heard them at dusk, but never during the day. So I think that answers the questions for the owls in this area. Barn owls, I've never heard those in the day either. And of course, some species like burrowing owls that we haven't talked about, yeah, you can hear those occasionally in the day. They're more vocal at night, though. Well, I think at that point it's getting kind of late, so maybe we should wrap it up. Ron, are there any other comments or questions?
I do not see anything else. And let me come up here. Yeah, I do not see anything else. Lance, that was wonderful. I can't say how much I really enjoyed it, and I saw Mark grinning all the way through it, so he enjoyed it. And it was wonderful.
Course.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, I see something else came in the Q&A thing.
Yes.
So yeah, John of course has infinite experience and says he has heard Flammulated owl well before dark in Arizona. Oh, okay. Thank you. I didn't know they did that.
Yep.
All right. Well, so I think we recorded this. Is that correct?
Yes, we have. Oh, by the way, thank you for reminding me. We did have a little YouTube, I think, had an issue with the live stream. So if you're still on our live stream and missed something, or if you're not on our live stream and want to catch it later, this recording is, this webinar has been recorded and will be up on our site soon.
Yes. Well, so Don White just commented that he's already forgotten some of this, which is why I asked if we recorded it so that you can then go back and check it at your convenience to try to sort some of this out, because yeah, it's a lot of information, and some of this I wouldn't expect everybody to be able to know all of this after just one short presentation like this.
Yes,
but
a lot to absorb. Also, I wanted to mention, sorry, Lance, that Lance did give a wonderful webinar on recording and does have recommendations for recorders and techniques. So that is a wonderful webinar to check out on our website. And
it was a talk back in September.
Yeah, a couple of things came in. Kudos and kudos. Lance.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. And with that, I think we're out of questions, and I think Lance is almost out of voice. So we want to say again, thank you very much, Lance. It was a wonderful, wonderful webinar. And thanks to Kimball Garrett for introducing you, and thanks to Mark for the terrible bird jokes. And I think that's about all the thanks that we have. With that, we'll be back in June with the webinars. We are starting to warm up for going back out in the field and bird classes, things like that. So we're getting very, very excited. I hope to see everyone out in the field soon. And with that, I think we'll bid you adieu. Good night.
Thank you,
All right.
Lance.
Thanks,
Good
everybody.
night. Good night, everyone.